The situation we're seeing around the world is impacting different societies in radically different ways, and it's showing both weaknesses and strengths in different health systems, political and social organization in a lot of ways. But one thing that continually comes up is the need for unconditional supports of different kinds, and that raises starting with healthcare, obviously, but going on beyond that. And that raises the question of unconditional basic income, which has kind of been thrown at people, laughed off just months ago as this kind of crazy fantasy land thing indulged in by some political few political radicals and some kind of kooky Silicon Valley guys. But suddenly everybody's talking about it, and some people have had to actually start doing something that looks a lot like it simply because of force of circumstance. And I thought this provides us with a situation where it's possible for us to compare notes about what is going on around in the world and rethink what this really means, what sort of problems it could address, how it would be administered, and what the larger implications will be. Is some form of UBI, unconditional basic income, a necessity in the post-COVID world? Are there alternatives to it? How does what's happened reframe the debate? And I think if there was a common theme for this episode, I think there's a lot to be discussed there. And this is an ideal group of people with which to do so.
Yeah, I am Emanuele Braga from Italy. I'm an artist and an activist and a researcher. And we worked a lot in the last years on this concept of basic income. And practically, we experimented in the last 5 years a pilot of basic income with this MACAO Cultural Center, co-managed by a community. So we create basic income and we share our resources monthly based within hundreds of people. And is created from the bottom, and is also like an experimentation in order to understand how we can like support each other's in the income, free our times, not being too much exploited and kidnapped by the labor market. And this is our practical base. On the other hand, we have a national network in Italy, like promoting the universal basic income. We had from the government in the last years also some pilots of conditioned basic income that is more like a support, but really in order to help people waiting for job in this labor crisis. And so we are in this national debate in order to foster an idea of unconditioned and not emergency idea of universal basic income. I don't know if Julio wanna add something.
Hello everybody, my name is Julio Linares. I am from Guatemala and I'm now based in Berlin at the moment. I am part of the Basic Income Earth Network, currently doing social outreach work for the network, connecting different parts of it and working together with many actors now that now the basic income is even becoming more of a household name. The work I do in Berlin is actually similar to that of Emanuel's. I work on a community currency project called Circles, which aims at aiming to get people to have a basic income from a community perspective by also sharing their resources and sort of create an economy from the bottom up. So our idea is how can we sort of issue a basic income to ourselves and to the people that we trust, and indirectly also to the people that our communities trust. So I do a lot of work here, like working with farmers, with care workers, with different actors, trying to figure out how can we create this sort of complementary economy from the bottom up. And so maybe we could start by doing a little round so everybody can introduce themselves and maybe say a bit of what's going on where you are, where you're located, and how has the COVID affected now your work, your life, your thinking, your writing?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Sarath Davala. I'm from India Network for Basic Income and also BN, Basic Income Earth Network. I'm the vice chair there. Now, I'm a sociologist by training, and my brush with basic income, universal basic income, started about 10 years ago when the union I was working with, Women's Union, Self-Employed Women's Union, decided to do an experiment on basic of universal basic income. So I was leading that study for 2 or 3 years, and that's where my own personal journey with the basic income has started. Because before that, for another 15 years, I've been working in the development, so-called development sector, as a researcher, evaluator, program evaluator, and all that. I quit my university job. I always used to come back from each field visit with a sense of disenchantment, a sense of disappointment that what I see actually doesn't work. But in order not to disappoint those who are working, you say nice words and then come back. So it was kind of getting on my nerves when this idea was experimented, and we practically stayed in the villages where we were doing this study. And something about this unconditionality, and when you give something to people unconditionally, what happens in their households and how they plan their life, how they make slight small modifications in their own, the choices they make, whether it is about should I borrow from David or should I borrow from somebody else. They make a slight difference between, slightly move away from one kind of a money lender to a soft money lender, and they send their child to from a bad school to slightly a better school. These are very small incremental changes. Then I realized that, my God, when you leave people to their own discretion, what happens? So I was really convinced that there is something about unconditionality, not about the money. The amount we gave was not very high. So since then, I've been working as an advocate of universal basic income, and now comes the COVID. Now, COVID has not brought any inequalities in the society. COVID has not brought, not yet. We have our numbers are not very high, but the lockdown that was implemented about 21 days ago brought our economy out. Like when there is a flood, all the ants from the underground come to the surface. You find really the underbelly of our economy, our employment situation. Really, the entrails are out there to see. I live in a city. Give a small example. I live in a city which has about 11 million population. Out of this, about 3 million, or a little more, I don't know, because our documentation is not perfect. They are migrant workers. They come from northern states, which are much poorer than this state is. So I mean, the contractors who brought them literally disowned them after a week, and then asked them to just do what they want to do. So they started walking back. Some of them started walking back to their villages because all the buses and trains, everything stopped. And some of them were caught by the police because the state only knows how to keep law and order. They converted it into a law and order problem. So they pushed them into shelters, government shelters. And in some of the shelters, people jumped out of the shelters. Men, women, children jumped out, and then they ran away. So we, on the one hand, so at the end of the day, at the beginning of this whole episode, we gave a proposal to the government about how they should give an emergency basic income. And government did not listen to us, and then slowly something small trickle is coming. But then soon we had to rush to the relief work because the hunger and starvation seems to be the main issue that we had to address rather than any other policy changes. So anyway, I'm in the middle of that kind of relief work. But then how long can you keep doing the relief work? And to what extent? We are a network of like 20 NGOs in this city. Now, we just don't know. Yesterday, 500 people started walking and police tried to stop. And then I think government also decided a soft approach that, okay, go walk 700 kilometers. If you die, it's your responsibility. I mean, it's that kind of a cruel situation that I'm facing today. And as a basic income advocate, I'm just appealing again and again through various means, through the network, to the government, that give money to them, not just rice. Governments want to define poverty as open, hungry mouths. We said, not that. He has to pay a rent. He has to pay an installment for his cart. He has to do something else. So he has to pay an interest. So I mean, that's the kind of a crisis I'm in the midst of. Sorry, my introduction was too long, but I think it's more the introduction of the context I am seeing, because the pandemic is global, but the pain is always local.
Yeah. So can I introduce myself? My name is Pettifor, and I'm in Britain, in Suffolk, in the east of England. And I'm self-isolating here because I'm a member of the vulnerable group. But in my little community, we're having to mobilize 900 meals every day for 900 elderly sick people. And the local hotel has volunteered to do that. The local butcher is donating meat. The local fishmonger is donating fish. And someone's going to put it all together and deliver it. But the vulnerable individuals are going to have to pay £2.50 each. So that's roughly what's happening here. But what's been extraordinary is the degree of voluntary mobilization and community action. It's just sprung up from, well, not from nowhere, from very deep roots, actually. But I wanted to say, and then of course we have a crazy government which has practiced herd immunity, which doesn't really have a strategy for getting us out of this, and which really is almost unchallenged because it has a massive majority. So I'm here because I'm a universal basic income skeptic. And the reason for that has to do with how it should be financed, how it's going to be paid for, essentially. But also because I'm an advocate of universal basic services, which I think are more important to achieve than in distribution terms than universal basic income. But I am perfectly well aware that right here in this crisis, we have to have the provision of basic incomes for everybody, because the system, the safety net that we have has got enormous holes in it, and there are an awful lot of people who are falling through the safety net. So I'm part of the New Economics Foundation, and we're promoting something called a minimum income guarantee, which we reckon will cost about £3 billion a month for 3 months is what we're proposing, at a cost of £9 billion. But I do think that ultimately my question is this, that the universal basic income is incredibly expensive to finance. And the reason it's expensive to finance is that it doesn't necessarily generate work, and it doesn't therefore necessarily generate income, which is needed to repay the initial layout, essentially. And that's the value of work, which is why I'm a full employment person. Full employment means people get income themselves from work, and that has to be regulated, so they get decent levels of income, of course. But at the same time, the government gets tax revenues to help pay for whatever investment the government has made. Not that tax revenues pay for it. The payment is originally financed through bond issues, but tax revenues help to balance the books. So that's my skepticism. I understand the importance of it, and I can see, for example, in India, the horrors of what you're facing right now, and how, at the very least, the government and the central bank, which can find billions of dollars to bail out corporates and has. You know, we worry about our minimum income guarantee costing £9 billion over 3 months, but we know that the government has found very much more to bail out and protect and guarantee the activities of big corporations. So we know the money is there and that it's possible. The question is ultimately whether the money is there in perpetuity, and that's my problem with universal basic income. You know, that in perpetuity we're going to find a minimum income for everybody, and we have no way of we can finance that from borrowing or finance that from whatever you call the activities of the central bank. But at some point, because of the way the monetary system works, that has to be balanced. That has to be restored to some sort of balance. And my question is, how is that done? And I have to tell you that I am on the Progressive Economy Forum with Guy Standing.
Mm-hmm.
I've had all the arguments from Guy, and Guy is, of course, the most articulate and the most prolific advocate of universal basic income. So I have heard the arguments, but on reflection, this is my skepticism, you know, and I leave it at that.
I came to this through being a welfare rights advisor for 10 years and seeing the holes that are in, and seeing not just the holes, but also the way poor people are basically tortured by the bureaucracy in order to get the benefits that they're eligible for. I've done a lot of tribunals, particularly for people with disabilities or disabled people, depending on where you are on that. Anyway, what's come out recently in the US is a poll saying that there's a majority of people that are in favor not just of basic income, but of a proper wealth tax. And that's certainly what we advocate, all right, is there need to be proper taxes, again, on unearned income. It's not like there aren't a lot of people, or enough people, not huge amounts of them, obviously, but, there's certainly enough people who are, being really undertaxed. And I think it's a real failure of the labor movement and the unions to really not flag this up over the last 40 years. This has been a progression for the last 40 years of, constantly cutting corporation tax, dividend taxes, other kinds of unearned income taxes. And to me, that's really where the money has to come from. If we're going to give people, if the state is going to, if there's going to be an income from the state that is unearned, then, then we need that to be for everybody and not just for the people with wealthy families who get, that's like 60% of the wealth is passed through families, it's not even earned. But there are people, particularly on the right wing, who will defend to the death their children's right to inherit money, even Jeff Bezos' right to inherit money. But they don't want to see a kind of inheritance for everybody. And, for me, it's really about that inheritance. The fact of the matter is that at this moment, the basic income movement in the UK has really come out of the woodwork. So, for example, Alex Sobel got a letter for an emergency basic income signed by 170 MPs and Lords. It looks like there's going to be some kind of cross-party group coming out of this, including a couple Tories, by the end, I don't know quite whenever Parliament gets back together again. But, I also worry, all right, that actually, our power isn't strong enough to make sure it's enough. Or that it will actually go to everybody and there won't be some kind of means test on it. And also like how do we form some kind of structure so that this lasts beyond the present moment. There's certainly a lot of MPs who really didn't like basic income at all, whether it was because they thought it would destroy work incentives. Usually it's that one, that they thought it was going to destroy work incentives, but now we're saying, well, actually, basic income would be the answer here. Yeah. And I'm not against universal basic services at all. I think we should be demanding everything right now that we need, and I don't see basic income as diametrically opposite to either services or a job guarantee, which is what is the alternative that most people, sort of counterpoise to basic income in the U.S. So yeah, I mean, I hope that, I really hope that there will be new, that this is the time really to be pushing for, well, what kind of society do we want to live in after this virus is over? And yeah, so that's my contribution right now.
Thank you, Barb. That's very, very helpful. For me, the paradox that came into my head when Anne was speaking is that on the one hand, we ultimately wish to decommoditize things. We wish to have caring relations which are done for their own sake or for the sake of each other, and want to minimize. I mean, money is essentially a rationing device, right? And it's just like a rationing chip that can be used for anything. Presumably a reasonable society would ration as little as possible. So we would want to move off of commoditization wherever possible. And paradoxically, unconditional support for people would mean that they could put their energies into the things they find important, whether or not it's deemed profitable, like taking care of their children or grandparents might not be is not currently valued, but it would be valued if you give everybody money. However, it would also mean larger parts of the economy are in fact decommoditized, which would have certain macroeconomic effects, which would then, it's unclear how that would play into the production of money that goes into a universal basic income. And I think that's what Anne was pointing at. I mean, painted in the broadest brush. But I'm not sure that like getting everyone in a wage labor job, whether they like it or not, is itself the best solution to that either.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the thing we're puzzling over.
What's really fascinating about UBI to me is how cross-ideological it can end up being, because it feels like there's three or so, probably more than three versions of it. There's like the kind of like save capitalism version of it, which is what you often find in Silicon Valley, which is just like, oh shit, we're like undermining the whole structure of production and so on, and then the system will collapse unless we give people money to keep the structure going and so on. Then we have the one which seems to be like quite prevalent right now, which is actually related, which is like help the precarious. All of those who are on the bottom need to be like kept going, which is related to that save capitalism one. But then there's the ones I guess David's been alluding to, which is the kind of like reduce work. Can we all relax more?
Reduce jobs, not necessarily work. Probably not, but mostly just jobs.
One of the sort of like slightly perplexing things I find in these basic income debates is, at least in the sort of mainstream media, it's often spoken about as if money itself is like a kind of like a substance. Mm-hmm. Like you give people like a syrup or something. It's like, here comes your monthly dose of the substance. But money is not a substance, right? We're talking about a system of claims built over the real, the actual value of an economy is not the monetary system, it's the underlying system. So when all these debates, we're talking about the interplay between the actual real economy and then the system of claims that's built on top of it. And I guess the thing we're trying to clarify is what happens when you alter the sort of movement, amount, or sort of directionality of those money flows. So for example, one of the questions we could ask in this basic income debate is this just a different way of doing welfare? I mean, we already have a welfare system which requires people to prove that they are entitled to certain things. Is basic income just a different form of welfare where you just say you don't have to prove it and we're just going to give it to everybody? In which case it will be subject to the same debates that we have around welfare without, it'll just be an alteration. Or are we talking about something fundamentally different? Because it is quite possible that we actually have no idea what these impacts would be, because we're trying to figure out what would happen. So for example, some of us think that people would stop working, right? And yet we would have more money to spend, which means actually there'd be an incentive for other people to work to try and get that money from us. So would it have a Keynesian stimulus effect or not? And I guess that's, I'm not sure if this is helpful right now, but I think these are massive unknowns.
Yeah, there's a lot of unknowns, especially when people talk about inflation. And I would be interested in what people feel about this. I mean, there's always the argument that UBI would be inflationary, and I think it could pull either way. On the one hand, you know, it's not the quantity of money, but the velocity of money. But people who are poor are more likely to spend it. You know, QE, they're just basically effectively giving money to rich people who mainly just sit on it and blow bubbles with property bubbles or what have you. You give it to people who are hungry, they will buy food, so it'll create more economic activity. So there's not something to be said for the idea that it might be more inflationary than current money creation, but there's also the fact that, you know, it could pull in the other direction. For example, I'm imagining that the telemarketing and general marketing industry would largely collapse if people don't need to do that anymore. No one's going to do jobs like that. Obvious bullshit jobs or you know, jobs where you're just bothering people for a living. And there'll be a lot less artificial creation of demand. So that would be deflationary.
This is a very small intervention. I just say that it's not another kind of welfare to my mind, because much of the welfare, the way we administer it, the way we deliver it, we stigmatize the recipient. Whether it is job guarantee, whether it is any kind. So usually the welfare system works the way that it identifies the exception and then gives, whether it is a lame man or a pregnant woman or any other such unemployed person. So it's the welfare system works on these exceptions. Whereas when you say it's universal and unconditional, you're actually trying to remove that stigma.
Yes.
And David said, I think if the supply side is good enough, it would not cause, because majority of people, they spend the money that they have because they have very limited money. They don't have huge amounts of money that they can hoard and save and all that. So they just spend. If you give them, they're already working in a deficit economy, their household economy. So when you give them money, they just spend that money, they repay the debts rather than cause inflation. That's the yeah.
Barb, you were going to say that.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, I've kind of moved away from the welfare framing around basic income and more into a dividend, you know, that it's everybody's right or inherit, you know, it's like, who was it? One of the big sci-fi writers, Heinlein. Yeah, I think it was Heinlein in the 30s talked about, he called his basic income scheme a heritage payment, you know, on the idea, and it's something that Guy Standing talks a lot about, which is, you know, how we are all the inheritors of, you know, the contributions of millions of people, most of whom we don't know them. I certainly have seen this. I mean, my dad was a military research scientist, and, you know, I mean, the stuff that they produced in the 70s, you know, each person got like $250 for their patent. Those patents included, you know, an alloy to make microchips industrially viable, Polaroid glasses, you know, breathable casts, you know, things, you know, memory foam. Okay, all that kind of stuff was actually created for the U.S. Air Force, right? Initially, okay, and you know, and have gone on to be the foundation of huge industries, you know, which are profiting. You know, they're sort of taking, you know, they bought those patents from the government, not for very much. And then, you know, now they're building huge, you know, huge profitable industries. Apple, for example, I mean, just to name a few, Google, whatever, anything that runs on technology that was developed in the military, you know, who's now profiting of it, you know, I mean, rather than socking their money away in, I don't know, you know, in tax havens and, they're sitting on, Francis Coppola talks about this all the time, about how much cash that these companies are actually sitting on. I mean, it's just disgusting how these companies have managed to get any kind of bailout. I mean, it really, yeah. Okay.
I was going to follow up your thought about heritage. That, if you really think about it philosophically, the inventors of most of the things that make our lives possible were not compensated, and they are our collective ancestors, all pretty much equally. I mean, there's nobody on Earth right now who isn't descended from Confucius, apparently, according to statisticians. I mean, whoever invented milk or cheese or chairs, I mean, we're all their descendants collectively, let alone the English language, which is a collective creation. All of these things which make the creation of value possible are things we are all creating all the time, and are heirs to the people who created. So the idea that some people deserve to get 80% of the income is produced by that, and the rest of us deserve to get 20 is just utterly bizarre and random. It's simply an effect of power relations. It has absolutely nothing to do with who created what. And I think that might be a place to start. One person,
Sorry, can I just say one more thing? And that's because I'm going to go in a few minutes. It's just the experience, we keep doing these experiments with basic income. I mean, I cannot believe that, there has been so much argument about giving everybody money when people are very happy for a certain class of people to get money without doing anything. All right. I mean, it's like we keep going round and round, whether it's on the left or the right, we don't know what this is going to happen. We can't know. We just don't know. Okay. What's going to happen macroeconomically to the labor market, whatever. But I really think as a matter of justice that we do have to start giving everybody money and do that experiment. And if it's messy and there are problems, we can work them out.
The reason why I wanted to make that sort of comparison with welfare is I totally agree that there's a sort of a cultural and a moral sort of debate that goes on around, but from a kind of macroeconomic perspective, these things can look very similar. All right, to Tesco, for example, a big supermarket chain in the UK, whether somebody gets money from a welfare system or through a basic income, it still manifests in their world as more products coming off their shelf. All right, they don't really care what your moral take on whether welfare is good or not is. It's to them, they just see this other thing, right? So I guess that's why I want to ask Anne in terms of so when we're looking, for example, at debates around welfare, people are seldom talking about inflation, right? But when UBI comes in, suddenly this is a big question. So are we saying that a UBI requires so much more spending or so much more, potentially money creation, and that's going to have a substantially different effect to a welfare system? Just to clarify that.
So, of course, the question of inflation, the right will come up with anything, and we can see how the right has been routed in this, this crisis over its ideologies, and in particular around austerity and so on. Suddenly it's okay to spend. Suddenly there is a magic money tree. So we just can't go along. We can't trust those guys because they will manipulate any argument to be hostile to something that is progressive. But what I wanted to say was, and it's a really important distinction that Brett makes between, the financing of a welfare system and UBI. But what I wanted to say was that it seems to me, I think the thing that I find difficult about UBI is that it is isolating one bit of the economy, when actually sorry, I forgot, I didn't get your name, the woman,
Barb.
Under huge petrol profits.
Barb.
But anyway, the point you were making, and the really important point, is the structure of the economy. The fact that Apple, Facebook, Google, Uber can cream off your father's inventions and make massive profits out of that and not be taxed is not your father's fault. It is the fault of a system, of a structural system. And I know this is probably irritating for you, But it seems to me that we're having to talk about UBI because we don't talk about the structure of the system. And I agree with you. We now live in a capitalist economy that is entirely a rentier economy. You're crazy. You're absolutely crazy in this economy if you invest in a project or a product, where if you take risks and you decide to invest and wait for something, for a return, and the idea of making profits, that is yesterday's story. Today's story is you don't invest in anything, you speculate, you sit on your butt and you collect the rent, essentially, effortlessly. And if you do anything else, if your work as a capitalist is not effortless, you're a failure, right? So if you're Mr. Uber, you sit on your backside in the Silicon Valley and you cream 20% of every Uber driver in the world, while you're making him a capitalist. You're making him or her buy the car, invest in its maintenance, supply it with petrol, buy the insurance, make sure you follow the laws and all that stuff, and please offer your labor at this very low price. And then you sit on your butt in Silicon Valley and it just comes screaming in. Now, that is and that's outrageous, but that is the way we structure the system, or allowed the system to be structured. And I want the left to be thinking about and talking about that far more, because UBI is a kind of salve. It's a kind of, how do we help these poor people who the society, the economy is incapable of creating work for or creating meaningful engagement for, basically. We are facing a climate crisis. The work that has to be done to tackle the climate breakdown is extraordinary. If we need a kind of a man or woman with a huge brain to help us think about how we can allocate that work and get it done in time, in time for us not to be wiped out by the failure of our life support systems. But we're not doing that work. Here we are sitting on our butts thinking about, taxing the rich, and how the hell do we do that? We have no power. We're thinking about how we pay for the poor. How do we do that? We have no power. And the system is not going to make it possible. So sorry to rant about this, because I too have to go, and it's always convenient to rant and then leave. But I think that's what frustrates me. The fact is, you have to think about why we need UBI within the structure of the economy, and we have to change that radically. And I have to say that 6 weeks ago, I would not have thought it was possible to even think about restructuring the economy. I think it's a very live issue now. And I would like the left to get off one aspect of the economy and to talk about that structural change, because actually we're at a position, at a point in time where actually we're going to be able to get the public behind structural change, but not if we just get ourselves preoccupied with one bit of the system. Sorry.
Sarath?
Barb, you want to say something since you two have to leave, or shall we take that one up?
Just one small point, which is that I really feel that the conversation about basic income over the last 5 years, especially, has really opened up a discussion of all the different things that you were just talking about, Anne.
Yeah.
And it really makes a lot of people who wouldn't think about those things, or think that they weren't able to think about those things, it gives them permission to really think about them and talk about them. So anyway, Sarath, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I just, it's a very small point that I think the affordability argument is a very weak argument against basic income, because I think the moral and the political objections to a universal basic income are much stronger and more widespread than the affordability. If the affordability question is the only question, and there are no moral and political objections to universal basic income, okay, then shall we start small and then slowly grow up? So in principle, do you agree that it's good in principle? Only thing is I can't afford it. So there is a problem with that. That's all I want to point out.
I was just going to say, and
go on.
Not to sort of complicate matters, but I think we can make a distinction between the moral intuition which is that in a world where we have large production and huge inequality, there's obviously a moral argument that there should be much better. We could actually totally provision for everybody, and we could provision equally and have prosperity. All right. So most people would actually agree with that, this idea that, like, why do some people have so much and some people have so little? The real question is whether the handing out of money tokens achieves that goal or not. Will all this be neutralized, for example, by a change in all the prices, such that actually a person still ends up precarious, despite the fact that they technically have more money? You know, and I think that's the sort of like where the moral question, which we would talk about, which is it right to combat inequality, which is like a debate in itself, can be separated from the question around, does the monetary system actually facilitate that goal that we argue about in this moral realm? This is why some people will make the argument that what you should rather do is actually hand out real goods, you know, actually give people stuff. So I just want to flag that up as a potential point of confusion that sometimes emerges into this debate. Is most people are going to agree on the moral point, but it's whether this actual UBI technically achieves that goal is the real contentious point often.
If I could respond to that really fast, but I think oftentimes the problem is that universal basic services and universal basic income are sort of put together as a false dichotomy, where in fact they can actually be mutually complementary to one another. And sort of, and going back a bit to the question that Anne raised, and would you think that it's also possible, talking about the structure of the economy, to transform the economy through the reformulation or the restructuration of the monetary institutions? You wrote a book about the production of money, and to me, it was a very interesting question when I was reading it about, is it possible to democratize money, like to get rid of central banks, for example, and run it in a more decentralized way as a sort of guiding principle for the future? Would that change the structure of the economy, or at least begin to do so in some way?
Yeah, so the answer to that is that of course we can. You know, the way the monetary system has evolved. So the history of the monetary system is a history of struggle between the people on the one hand, the demos, the democracy, and the 1%. And right now, the 1% manage the monetary system. As a result, the 1% get everything they want out of the monetary system. As a result, Wall Street, the city of London are all being bailed up. The people don't manage and don't have a say over the monetaries, but we have lived through periods where the people have had much more, I wouldn't say control, but much more say over the way the system is managed, and where it's been far more democratic, not just at individual country level, but across the board. So, yeah, this is a struggle. This is a huge struggle. And, you know, the left doesn't even think it's a fight. My worry is the left worries about micro issues and this big macro issue about who runs the system. Now, in India, for me, it is a crime in India that there are people that have no work, and there are people whose work is not appreciated and doesn't get valued properly. These are crimes. The fact that our NHS nurses are paid pittances is a crime, but it's a consequence of the way we manage the system. Yesterday, I heard a nurse, an epidemiologist, the Spanish epidemiologist, was asked why they hadn't been able to develop a vaccine yet. She said, "Excuse me, you pay me 1,800 euros a month. You pay Ronaldo, the footballer, 1 million euros a week. For God's sake, go and ask him to solve the coronavirus problem." And that's the point. Now, why is that system like that? And you know, and the system could be far more distributive and far more fairer, and the monetary system could be repivoted, could be serving the interests of the public as a whole and not serving the 1%. At the moment, we have to do that. But as long as we ignore them and let them carry on doing as they are, they will carry on creaming off the stuff, and we will carry on having people that have to have UBI in order just to survive. And, you know, that seems to me that's the problem. But I do apologize. It's 4 o'clock and I have another meeting.
I had a good response.
And I thank you so much for including me.
You know, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
Can I just make one last point? Also, because I'm going to have to go in about 2 minutes. I think just an answer to Brett. All right, the thing, and maybe you guys can discuss this a bit more. The other thing is with money. Okay, it's very much internalized. All right, so like we live in a society where people, view each other by how much money they get. I mean, it doesn't matter whether they get it through working or whether they get it, through inheritance, but but people judge each other by how much that is. And I think there'd be a huge symbolic value of giving everybody the same amount. All right, just as as a human right. Okay, so you're a human, here you go, so it's not just, and plus people associate money with freedom.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now, we can argue about whether money's actually, freedom, or whether it's a trap or whatever. Okay, and I'm totally sympathetic to those arguments. All right, and I would love to see a system where we don't need money at all. Okay, in some ways, at least certainly this system. But I really do feel that basic income is like if we're going to get there, we have to kind of start by giving everybody the same, as a way of at least symbolically saying, look, we're all actually the same, all right, in some fundamental way. So yeah, I mean, I'm totally sympathetic to what you were saying about tokens and whether this is really where we want to go and stuff. And maybe I didn't quite understand it. Okay, but yeah, I mean, I did want to sort of put that in about, again, the symbolic value to society of everybody getting the same. And with that, I have to go. Have a great discussion. I look forward to seeing the recording later. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye.
If I can say something, I think this moral and cultural issue is also related to, from our point of view, to an invisibilization of care labor and reproduction. Because probably this central role of production of goods and markets is totally out of focus. For example, now under pandemia, in lockdown, we are living, it's super self-evident how is central the role of nurses, doctors, education in our apartment of the kids, mutual aid, bottom up, taking goods in this logistic of the commons that is rising up everywhere. And I think also basic income is the space to free this self-organization and this central role of reproduction and care, no? So the cultural and the moral issue is more, I think, a revolution is more about a revolution, a cultural revolution we have to push forward in order to push in the central role of the reproduction labor instead of finance and also production of goods. Cooperation is the central role, and it's not true that the people having the possibility to cooperate in this way are lazy or are doing nothing. No, when you free this possibility, there is another logic that rise up.
And Pettifor was saying, as far as I understood everything, that UBI did not really address the structural issues of the economy, the financialization of the economy, the fact that it's a rent-seeking economy. But isn't it the same thing? Isn't it the fact that we have a rent-seeking economy? Isn't it because we've got a top-down monetary system, and therefore, if you want to make money, then you need to provide services for the people at the top of the monetary system. Whereas if you had a kind of UBI monetary system, then you will make money by providing services to people at the bottom of the monetary system, and therefore maybe you will have also would be a way to realign the pay of people, such as, for example, nurses, that will get a better pay because they provide people services for the people, for everyone at the bottom of the pyramid system. Whereas today, if you want to make a lot of money, you don't have to provide goods or services for the bottom of the pyramid.
No, you could just threaten them a lot.
You need to provide goods or services for the people at the top. So it's just so today, if you want to make money, you need most of the time to provide some kind of rents and to extract wealth and to direct it at the top. So I don't think that the moral argument against UBI is really good, because even the work moral argument, it seems to me that if your value is work and so on, then if you want people to earn a lot of money if they work hard and if they provide goods and services to society, then the best way to do it maybe could be to have a transformation of the monetary system from a top-down monetary system to bottom-up.
Hello, Cory.
Hey, Cory.
Hi. Pleasure to see you folks.
You missed Barb Jacobson and Pettifor. We're having a very interesting debate about basic income.
I heard that this was about basic income, so yeah, I'm excited to see where you folks are getting at with the subject.
Well, I mean, the basic debate was Anne is essentially saying that it's not clear to her as a political economist where the money would really be coming from, because money would be provided, but some of it would be used for activity which would tie back and create value in the money economy, and a lot wouldn't, which is kind of the point. But if so, it creates a sort of will create a sort of macroeconomic imbalance. And the second objection she raised was that it's kind of it's ultimately kind of a welfare gesture. It's not approaching the basic structural relations of power in the economy, and we do have a moment right now where those real structural issues can be addressed or discussed, at least can be put on the table in a way that just would have been unthinkable certainly 10 years ago and probably 3 months ago. So is that at this point a half measure by essentially saying, oh, the poor guy, give him some money, rather than let's talk about class power. Let's talk about the fact that our economy has basically become one of rents. As she was talking, I actually thought of the phrase of privatization of rent. As they cut taxes on the rich, the privatization of tax. As they cut taxes on the rich, rich people increasingly are not actually producing anything, but simply collecting rents, which is so they just turn taxation power over to the private sector. And that's kind of become the basis of the system. So does UBI actually address that, or is it, one debate was, well, is UBI simply saying everybody should get rents of a certain kind? We created all this technology, this knowledge, this value. If you think about what makes our lives possible is collectively created by our ancestors. The fact that their ancestors has to have a patent shouldn't outweigh that. So there, and Barb emphasized the moral point of saying, no, we are all deserving of the means of life as a sort of moral starting point of any further discussion of political economy, which UBI would introduce and sort of take as your starting ground. We also discussed alternative universal basic services. There was some mention of job guarantee, but the general feeling seemed to be that, is this really an alternative? Why aren't these things complementary? Isn't it a question of degree?
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm not an economist. I'm a science fiction novelist and an activist. And so sometimes this feels like I'm getting out of my depth. But I'd like to give you like a very short potted history of where I started with UBI and where I've ended up, which is that, when I first encountered the idea of UBI, it was at the same time as there was quite a vogue for this idea of like fully automated luxury communism. And the story we were telling ourselves that we were headed for a future in which humans were incidental to production, and that, this is not necessarily apocalyptic, because it would be lovely to be freed from drudgery, but only if there was some kind of rebalancing. And I had a lunch with a friend of mine who's an economist who's more of a neoliberal, much more of a neoliberal than I am, but who I think of as a very honest broker, who I don't think is there to shore up Klutz. I think he's actually there for because he thinks it's the right thing, a guy named Tim Harford. And he said, you know, once robots make everything, we're going to have to give some money to people who don't own robots so they can buy the things that robots own. And that's sort of where I came from with UBI. I even wrote a novel based on this idea, The Walk Away, where we have just fully automated luxury communism. But since then, the urgency of the climate crisis has made it pretty clear to me that we have guaranteed full employment for 300 years for every human being alive now and who will be born in the next 3 centuries, doing things like relocating every coastal city in the world, as well as, you know, coping with traumatized refugees, hundreds of millions of pandemic victims. This is not the last pandemic we'll experience as a consequence of climate change, and so on and so on. And that in that context, UBI feels like a bit of a distraction. I mean, obviously, in this moment, when we're using money to do allocation, which, you know, we may continue to do in the future, the fact that no one is doing anything that anyone will pay them for suggests that central banks should procure a bunch of the services that the private sector isn't looking for, and that this won't necessarily be inflationary because it's just putting in the money back into the system that would otherwise be there, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, when this crisis is passed, the lesson I think we might learn from this is that when the house is on fire, sometimes the fire chief says you have to stop using the water for your shower so we can put out the flames. And in the same way that we've, you know, told Ford, I'm sorry, you are now in the ventilator business, not in the car business, we might control inflation in an extremely loose monetary future system built around combating an existential climate crisis with not just war bonds and not just high taxation at the top rate, but also with rationing. We might just say there are certain resources you cannot allocate for purposes other than climate remediation. And so, yeah, there's a jobs guarantee in there too, but like, it does suggest that maybe UBI is just a tool in a toolbox that also includes markets, also includes a bunch of other things, but which is organized primarily around a kind of New Deal war footing with massive allocations by some legitimate, you know, insert how do we get a legitimate central authority here to, you know, rescue our species and planet from its certain destruction.
My first thought, though, is what would you say to this? I mean, like what we have in this pandemic situation that we're in, it seems like the most useful thing that a lot of people could do. Hey, Barb, you're back, great. The most useful thing that a lot of us seem to be able to do is to stop going to work. You know, I mean, and I think that's true of climate change as well. I mean, suddenly, you know, like carbon emissions have plummeted, like they can see the Himalayas in India, they can, you know, there's all this sort of opening up of the environment, and skies clearing, just dolphins are swimming in Venice. You know, it's kind of amazing how fast the world popped back the moment we stopped working so much. And it's possible we won't get to the point where we have to relocate cities if we just stop working so much. And, you know, being someone who has written on the topic, you know, I do feel a little vindicated that, you know, a very, very large part of the work being done is simply work done essentially to satisfy the egos of powerful people. One of the themes that I see emerging in this whole conversation is how much money is connected to power. You know, they say that money is connected to productivity. That's the official ideology. But really, it's power. I mean, that's what we learned with the 1%. 1% was a concept of class power. It's the people who can turn their money into political influence and turn that into the right to do even more rent extraction and even more power. So the question would be, how do you change that a system where money value is ostensibly based on production, but actually based on power to just give yourself money, into something more democratic? Can you democratize the money system, or would you have to reorganize the whole thing around, as someone suggested, a concept of care, which I'm more sympathetic with. But would it really require more work that is organized as work? That is to say, you seem to imply there's some central, you know, Anne talked about a giant brain, Cory's discussion seemed to imply that there's somebody coordinating and giving commands to all of this. Another thing that we've discovered, the government isn't very good at that kind of coordination. And like in a lot of places in this country and elsewhere, communities have had to take up doing that work. There's no one else to do it. Cory.
So I want to jump up the stack one and respond to David. So I'm presently working on my next science fiction novel, which is a utopian post-Green New Deal novel called The Lost Cause, about truth and reconciliation with white nationalist militias after a successful Green New Deal. And in that scenario, where the way that we address the point that you raised, that maybe doing less is the way that we rescue the climate, is that the dominant motif is that you make hay when the sun shines, that when renewable energy circumstances are positive, there is more energy than you can actually use, and that's when the factories turn on. So you have things like factories in the middle of the San Fernando Valley where I live, that when it's 48 degrees centigrade and cloudless, as it often is all summer long here, you have people who are fixing prefab slabs of concrete, but that when the sun goes behind the cloud, you declare a Jubilee Day. Everyone gets a holiday, and that our network communications afford to us the potential to find people to play with on a moment's notice. That we can have that loose improvisational style that is the hallmark of network communications, as opposed to that long fuse holiday that was characteristic of the era of high street travel agencies, right? It's just a moment's notice. You get in a Zeppelin. The Zeppelin has no impellers except for minor course correction. It goes where the wind takes you. Once you find out where that is, you use big, cool, non-exploitative, non-extractive social networks to figure out who you're going to hang out with when you get there and what you're going to do. It's essentially free, right? It is free energy in the sense that it's using this. It's arbitraging to the places where there's an excess of energy, the activities that we need. As to the question of whether we can avert relocating all the coastal cities, I think that ship has sailed. I think we are past that point. I think every coastal city in the world will either have to be radically transformed or moved in our children's lifetime or possibly their children's lifetime. I don't think that's barring miraculous technology that can not only fix a bunch of the carbon that's out there now, but also do things like correct for the heating of the sea that has already taken place. I think we're cooked.
No, I just wanted to touch on something I wanted to bring up something that David kind of touched on, and it's certainly where I'm coming from on this, as well as the welfare question, is the question of unpaid work, all right? And the amount of work that so many, especially women, but certainly everybody does in one form or another to look after themselves or other people. And, again, with the COVID crisis, we're finding out, what we actually depend on, all right? And most of that work is either unpaid or it's underpaid or it's insecure. And, again, it's like, I'm not actually that worried about inequality anymore. I'm much more worried about insecurity and where that's taking politics right now, and the kind of the way that, the insecurity is actually now at almost all levels of society, except, unless you're actually, able to live off your parents' dividends or something, and that's really, for me, UBI, directly addresses that. Obviously, we would also need housing, secure housing. We would also need, access to fuel as it stands at the moment, or better technology for sure. But yeah, it's, for me, it's like, the current system has profited so much off of people's unpaid work, and whether that's work in the home or whether that's actually work that's not paid for in various factories or businesses. I think that's really a crucial question. And and for me, that's one of the big arguments for UBI.
Yeah, this was my point when you were out of the conversation. Yeah, this central role of reproduction and care work as the real motivation also to push forward for UBI, I think is the point. And I think we miss the point if we use only quantitative category in terms of in order to question the value issue, no? So the new this gift economy also relax is not simply nothing, no? In terms of value creation, is not simply nothing. Is the pillar on which this also crisis of pandemia is based on. This care work is saving our ass now, no? And this is like always considered by financial system, production and labor as nothing, as without any value, no? So this UBI fieldwork has to like reverse totally the question of the value. This new economy is based on also a qualitative new social fabric, no? And so my question is how to frame this new concept of economic space, not only on this quantitative redistribution of money in itself, no? Money is something, but is simply something that supports a new ecosystem of relations, also not only human.
And I guess one of the questions, again, going back to my little like bugbear about money versus real economy stuff. Can I ask you a question on that? Actually, you and Barb. I mean, one of the ways to potentially conceive of this is if you imagine, I mean, I know lots of like feminist economists and people will sort of visualize the market economy as being built upon a foundation, an unrecognized foundation of care work and all sorts of other forms of work, almost like the hidden foundation of an iceberg. And the market economy is only the tip. So is the UBI argument in this context that those at the tip of the pyramid are extracting from that bottom section and therefore take the money from the top and spread it all along the bottom to compensate for that, essentially that sort of subsidy, as it were, that the care layer gives to the top? That was a kind of a complex way of saying it, but is that the sort of intuition?
This iceberg is the history of economy.
Well, I mean, there is definitely one aspect of that, and Barb could speak to that because she was involved in wages for housework, for example, which is very much directly addressing that kind of issue. There is uncompensated work, which makes the capitalist system possible, which the capitalist system just takes for granted they'll get for free, pay up, Well, and then what would that mean in practice? Maybe Barb would like to address that directly.
I think Sarath had his hand up, so I'll cede it to him, actually.
No, I just wanted to add to this question by Brett that I think it's not intuition, Brett. It's actually, there is empirical, you can verify it empirically, that the care part of our economy, this is the classical care part of the economy is the invisible work that the women that put into the system, but also there's a huge informal economy where underpaid people subsidize the system. So there's a huge invisible subsidy going into keeping the system in equilibrium and growing, whatever growth that means for who. So the point is that this COVID situation comes, and we have a saying in our language that there are some situations in life that separate milk and water clearly. You can clearly see. So this is a kind of a lab situation where I would say David's point about the bullshit jobs is also coming out very clearly who is needed and who is not needed in this wretched system that we have. Now, I was talking to a cousin of mine who is the head of a pharmaceutical company which employs about, at the moment, in an emergency situation, they have 1,000 people going in and out. Out of the 1,000 people, 200 are the white collar guys. Now, all of them are asked to go and sit at home and work from home. So being the head of that plant, he says, out of these 200 guys, I need only 20. The 180 are useless. They are not needed to run my system. And all the travel we used to do, monthly meetings in the city of Bombay, are not required. We are achieving much more sitting here and doing Zoom calls and Skype calls. So similarly, you also see that the same lab situation is also showing us that from excess we have moved to essentials. So much of the unnecessary stuff is also coming out. We are also proving that we can live with this minimum. This is what is enough to live. But then we top it up with a lot of froth is there. I'm not an economist, but then I can see the same thing is about the financial system. What is the hot air and what is the real value creation that is happening? We can very clearly see that as well.
Well, I have a lot to say about that, but someone else would like to sound in, I'm sure.
Yeah, what do you want me to speak? I mean,
Bob, you wanted to say?
Not much. I mean, I'm thinking more about, I mean, this is kind of tangential to this particular discussion, and I hope we go further with it.
Mm-hmm.
But just to say that, I mean, that wages for housework, and I think actually the demand for basic income is the same, you know, has a similar function of, again, kind of exposing what is there that we don't look at normally. All right, so wages for housework force people to actually, and in fact, you know, the women who promoted it back in the 70s were very clear about this. We don't know how this would happen. Okay, they didn't have a plan. Okay, unlike the basic income crowd, which has like, you know, 5 zillion different plans for how you do this. Okay, and you know, whether that's crypto or from the state or whatever. But the point of wages for housework was really to expose the housework, all right, to expose the importance of housework and how, you know, it's kind of fundamental base, you know, how it was the kind of fundamental basis of society. You know, I mean, I think various points. I mean, nobody changes their own nappies, for example. So, I mean, it's like, well, you know, so nobody, you know, and nobody, Brian Eno made this point really well a few years ago that, you know, even ideas are a collective. You know, they come out of the collective, that no one person has an idea completely shorn away from their own community. So, you know, all of that, okay, that our system, the current shit system, you know, as Sarath was saying, you know, profits by this. And now we're seeing, all right, what actually needs to happen and what doesn't. Yeah, that's all I want to say.
I just want to add to this what Bob has said. I want to link what my rant to universal basic income, that all our questions and all our objections come from this hypocritical system, which profits from the huge subsidy that is given by the huge informal sector we have. In India, out of the workforce, I think the informal part, the so-called precariat part, is 93%. I mean, you're talking about the non-precariat as the exception. The precariat is the norm. So in my view, every underpaid slave is subsidizing the system, which includes women in the house as well. So we have to change. We have to shift the conversation to this platform and then say, do you think, to the issue that we are addressing, because essentially basic income is a response to an issue, a situation that we describe as an issue or the problem. And what is the problem? And unless we agree with the problem, we can't agree with the solution.
Oh, hi. So, excuse me. I think that, you know, smarter people than me have observed that if billionaires need you to go to work so that they can retain their fortune, then their fortune was not grounded on their work, it was grounded on your work. And that is certainly something we're living through right now. But apropos the role of finance and money and financial policy, I heard some pretty interesting observations observations this week on the Trash Future podcast, Good Lefty podcast out of the UK, where they were observing that, you know, one way or another, this crisis ends with something like 20 to 30% unemployment. And there's two possible outcomes from that, you know, pretty high likely scenario. One is that we will enter into a period of incredible instability and collapse because 30% of the people will remain unemployed, and there won't be any neighboring states to kind of pitch in or restabilize things, or even just, you know, do the kind of Turkish thing of creating a paramilitary, you know, no man's land between the collapsing region and the region that has relative stability. So that's one possibility. The other one is that we'll end up with something like state employment, which might look like a UBI, or it might look like a job guarantee or something else, a Green New Deal core. But if 30% of the workforce is employed by the state, which is the creator of money, not the user of money, then the markets become totally irrelevant to those people. Right, the role of finance capital, you know, which is in our lives, whether we like it or not, in as much as it's the centerpiece of our non-defined benefits market-based pensions, or it dictates the fortunes of our employers, or whatever it is that it does, you know, that will cease to be central to the lives of almost everyone, even to the extent that you know, it is today, you know, completely distant from our lives, and it will relegate the people who watch the line and pray with all their might that the line goes up and curse the gods when the line goes down. It'll relegate them to the fringe role that they've historically had, which is the not very bright, you know, financial plumbers who get to go home every day at 5 o'clock, but who and are well compensated, but who don't, you know, command our economy or its outcomes. So one way or the other, I think we are entering into an era in which the centrality of finance's desires for our policy is going to be very threatened, if not completely sunset.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I keep saying this, one of the most telling things that I've seen was a debate about whether to shut down Wall Street for a week or two as it was, you know, kept crashing. And there's a long argument about it in some mainstream magazine, I forget which. But what really struck me was nobody in the discussion actually said that simply shutting down Wall Street was going to hurt anybody in any way. I mean, even the defenders of Wall Street couldn't come up with any good reason to have it around. It would just be sort of symbolically bad. It would be a gesture of defeat, you know. So the people are realizing the financial market can't help you very much. It can hurt you, as we learned in 2008, and that again is a sign that what we're really talking about is power here, and not actually productivity or the language that they dress it up in at all. And that's becoming more and more exposed. But I think that there was an interesting relation of that to the point about precarity that both Barb and Sarath brought up. That, you know, there's a very small number of people that put themselves in a relatively secure position because they control the power to give themselves money. The Cantillon effect is sometimes called. And, you know, you have everyone else who's increasingly, you know, they manipulate total terror and insecurity as the basic conditions of your day-to-day existence. You're not guaranteed anything. You're constantly being told that you don't deserve to be guaranteed anything. But one thing that people don't point to that much is that the depoliticizing effect. Pierre Bourdieu made a very good point about this. He said that, you know, the more secure people's jobs, the more likely they are to take part in political parties, in local activist initiatives, because, you know, if you don't know if you're even going to be able to live in this place, in this town, this neighborhood, have this industry in a year, well, you're not going to invest long term into reforming it and changing it. So by creating this precarious life for people, they secure their own power, and they make it impossible for anyone to make any kind of long-term plans to challenge it. And that's why I just don't see a contradiction between the dichotomy that Anne was introducing, that are we going to create popular power to make long-term plans to address this, or are we going to just give people money? I think giving people money gets rid of the insecurity, which will make it possible for people to actually do that democratic organizing, to start addressing those structural problems. and also move the cities.
I was just going to say, in terms of like the state taking a more active role, the question of where the actual financing happens, is it through the money creation processes, or is it through some kind of taxation process? I think this is like a huge debate, which in some ways I think there's a kind of Keynesian stimulus argument being made through the guise of UBI, this idea that you can actually just create new money to pay people, which isn't actually, to me, technically UBI. It's more like a kind of helicopter money type of proposal. And I've seen that floating around as being called UBI. I've historically thought of UBI as you taking money out of the system through taxation and then pushing it out to redistribute it. Whereas, yeah, I mean, I think you get the point. But in some ways, this idea of is there technically a massive difference between the state doing a kind of like paying people, or like the state being an employer to people and paying them money, versus the state just paying people money without employing them? Does that make sense? So that went around in circles a few times.
No, I mean, see, this whole idea about giving money to people, if we can, for a moment, pause from the industrial ethic of only work. If you pay only if you work, there has to be a transaction. Otherwise, no value can be transferred to you. No security can be transferred to you. If money is representing security, we are actually saying that unless there is a transaction in the labor market, there's no other way I can give you this. So can we pause that logic, that ethic, that industrial ethic for a moment, and then think outside that? Why have we made that so sacred? That's the only question I want to add.
Maybe just to like maybe go back with that, is in some of those old school kind of like Keynesian debates, is this idea that the state should just pay people to dig holes and then fill them in again. All right. Almost as if like, to justify giving money, I need to make you do something, which is kind of going into what you're saying. Whereas actually, partly what the UBI is talking about is like, you don't have to do anything and then you get the money anyway, which, I mean, I'm wondering, to the state, is it any different?
So I think it's like we are stuck with some kind of an ethic, a kind of a moral apparatus, and we have to do a role play just to give that. I mean, this is ridiculous. I think we just have to get rid of that. That's all.
Well, yeah, I mean,
yeah, because the value basically depends on debt or labor, and we are captured in this binary logic, and the challenge is to see beyond this opposition. Value is not only production based on labor or debt.
mm-hmm.
Our economical culture is based on debt and labor, and we don't see anything else.
Mm-hmm.
I think we are definitely living through a moment that vindicates the idea that governments don't need to tax to create money, and that government saving money is basically useless, right? If you sat on your surplus for the last 10 years and then decided to spend it all on ventilators, the fact that there are no ventilators to be procured makes the amount of money that you've stored up completely irrelevant, right? The way the governments build capacity is not by saving money, it's by spending money on capacity, particularly by procuring things that the private sector isn't trying to procure, or that the private sector is prohibited from procuring, either through rationing or some other process. And so I think the money question is actually kind of settled here, right? Like the government doesn't need to tax to spend any more that Apple needs to wait until you've redeemed an iTunes gift voucher before they can issue another one, right? Governments don't pile up our taxes and then spend them again at the end of the year. Governments annihilate the money that we remit in taxation and create new money when it's time to procure things. Given that, apart from the private money created by the banking sector, all money in circulation originates through the government, there is no way for us to pay our taxes until the government has spent the money. That the government's deficit is the private sector's credit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point is, in terms of when we're having this UBI discussion, are we talking about UBI finance through essentially the creation of money, or are we framing it in terms of, if we want to put it in MMT terms, are we framing it in terms of we're going to take money out of the system through taxation and reissue it to recipients to keep the money supply the same? And that's right. And I think that's
I think that, and I'm not an economist, but I think that misstates the MMT frame. I think the MMT frame is that we take money out of the system for lots of reasons, like preventing inflation, limiting the power of the people who are in the top decile of wealth possession and so on. But we don't take money out of the system to pay for anything. We never take money out of the system to pay for things. We take money out of the system to prevent inflation or to rebalance political power and enshrine pluralism.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, and I think the point is that the part of the Keynesian argument is around money creation. So that we shouldn't be caring about taxing. We should just like spend it out and boost the demand. But I think this is a sort of fundamentally a separate thing to the debates we have around a sustained basic income. So a sustained basic income over time, if you're going to constantly finance it through money creation, potentially becomes unsustainable. When I say finance it, I mean just like spend it into existence, you know? And I think so right now the immediate debate that you're finding in the press is sometimes actually just money creation. But I think this is a slightly separate debate to the one we've historically had about UBI, which is actually it's going to require at some level to frame it in old school monetary terms, you know, taxing to like spend, that kind of shit, you know? But like, you know what I mean? Like keeping the money supply stable whilst redistributing income.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that we're not talking about that the money supply is a distraction here. That the thing that matters is, as we found out with the irrelevance of dollars for procuring ventilators beyond the economy's, or our infrastructure's capacity to produce ventilators, is that what we're talking about is capacity, right? So what are we going to do to prevent the same more dollars from chasing the same capacity? Historically, the way that that's been managed by states during periods of pluralistic expansion, the 30 glorious years and so on, is by investing in that capacity, right? Paying people to do stuff that either has immediate or long-term benefit, and that doesn't crowd out what the private sector is trying to do, except intentionally, where you might say, well, we're going to crowd out extremely low-wage, precarious jobs by offering better-wage, non-precarious jobs, including payment for traditionally unpaid labor, so that there's no reason, apart from masochism, that anyone would ever take a low-wage, sub-minimum wage job, because you can always walk into a government job.
I don't think we should visualize the economy as a static system where I think there is a limited amount of currency and then which has to be redistributed here, there, or whatever. You have to tax the rich to pay the poor. I don't think. Let's open many questions then. Let's open the questions of the commons. I think Guy has written lots about it. Let's open the blue commons. Let's open, in India, for example, I think there's an NGO which is working which are on the mines. So they say that they went to the Supreme Court and said that mines belong to people. They are the owners, and state is just a custodian or a trustee. Now, the Supreme Court in India has accepted that premise and said that, yes, so which means that if people are the owners, people have a right to ask the questions, how are you managing my money? So when they actually, this particular NGO called Goa Foundation, when they went into the details of how the mines are given on contract to the miners, and what is the way in which the money is accounted for, you find that that money in the accounting system is written as windfall money. Now, let us open all these questions now when it comes to, so we can't look at the current pool of money and say, within this we have to manage. I think we have to open many more philosophical and political and the economic questions before we can answer that question.
Yeah, just the reason why I flag this up is that in the conservative version of this debate, the immediate question that will get thrown in is, how do you pay for the UBI and all that kind of stuff, right? And I think it's just worth.
But we don't. I mean, I'm tempted to actually call this entire broadcast the Magic Money Tree News. I mean, a gigantic magic money tree, about 800 stories tall, just blossomed in the middle of London, and it's raining money everywhere. That argument's over. We know they can just make it up and make it disappear. And money is just a bunch of promises we make to each other, which can be rearranged when circumstances change, such as they have. And I think that we're trying to start from the baseline of, if you recognize that and take that as the ground of our discussion, what then, how then do we rethink everything? We still do have to rethink, about the dynamics of money creation and what will be its implications. There's moral, it's political, economic, it's social implications, and that discussion is one we want to have. But the sort of like, how are you going to pay for it, seems to be the one we're trying to avoid.
If I could chip in a little bit here, I mean, I totally agree with David.
What's your mic?
Sorry, yeah, I was just gonna say that I totally agree with what David says. When money is just a set of promises we make to one another, and I would like to sort of throw in the idea of, if money. I mean, Marxists often think of money as a commodity, and I'm wondering, with the talk of UBI, is it possible to both decommodify labor, our work, our bodies, and also money in this process, maybe even outside of the state structures, which somehow always locks our imagination into sort of the limits of the possible, into thinking of other ways of making it happen. Polanyi always talks about the fictitious commodities, land, labor, and money.
That's right.
What happens if money just, it's shown us what it really is, a set of promises that are being plundered into commodities. And what happens if we can sort of reshape that somehow?
I mean, Julio, just as as somebody who's worked on, I don't know if Matt's still on the call, but sometimes there's an intuition in alternative currency circles to that money, the sort of values of money can be repurposed to create sort of a communitarian ethos. And actually, just to play devil's advocate a bit, and again, having worked on a lot of these projects, there is a question about whether that's a bit like trying to use a solvent as a glue, to put it that way. Actually, there's certain principles within money that fundamentally commoditize and distance people from each other. Right. And if you're trying to use that medium to bring people together, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's an interesting sort of philosophical debate to actually have, whether you actually can use a monetary system to fundamentally. And if I was going like on a sort of a kind of a hard left route here, I might actually, if I was attacking UBI, which some people in the hard left will do, they'll say, well, you're trying to use a sort of tool of a capitalist system as a way to sort of like dilute it a bit maybe, but fundamentally you're still using something which is inherent to the workings of a market system. So that's just the devil's advocate position.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I get this a lot from my friends here in Berlin, who are like, oh, why are you for basic income? We should have to abolish the state and capitalism altogether. And I'm like, yeah, I agree. But we also have to transform how money works. We have to decommodify money. We have to decolonize it. It's Barb said it. It's really inside of us. It's in our bodies. Like, if you talk to a German about money, it's like really awkward all of a sudden. Like, nobody talks about it in the labor force, in the companies and so on. It's embedded within everything, but somehow we just don't find ways of talking about it and transforming our relationships to it. And so I agree with you that it has been a tool of enslavement, but can we turn it into a tool for liberation? That's the question.
But in our experience, decommodify money is a central issue. So in a way is how to state that we need liquidity, but we don't mind to have money for yourself. In a way, for example, having a common wallet to co-manage, based on a self-evaluation, and everybody can pick what is useful, For example, in our experience, sometimes it is only a pretext in order to debate about what is useful for you, for the community, and so on. It's simply a pretext in order to have a breakfast together and speak about how to co-manage this wallet. So the problem is not the competition, is how to deactivate the competition having more money than you, but a pretext in order to have a debate together or about what is useful. And so is this ethical and cultural engine that we have to deactivate. Money is nothing, but we need liquidity. No, it's like I need the bike, but I can throw the bike in the canal if it's not needed. No, is how to deactivate this affectivity we have with money. So it's more a matter of relation and quality than a quantity issue. And you can discover that, yeah, you can issue money. For example, Brett, that we did a lot of cryptocurrency of every kind of in the financial, in the crypto market, outside, in a cooperative system, in a community-based, and so. But in the end, you can issue money. But the problem is how the relations fabric, the cooperation, and the production of relationship use this money.
I wanted to mention J.T. Harvey's idea that markets and by extension money are a tool, and that if you met a carpenter who said, well, I'm a screwdriver man, and if you expect me to drive a nail, you're asking me to do something that's just morally wrong, and the only things that can be built should be things that can be built with screws, we would be extremely skeptical of that carpenter. Likewise, I think that anyone who says that that markets are never a good way to solve allocation problems is wrong. And there are fewer of those people, although there are some on the hard left, than there are people who say that markets are the only way that we should solve problems, and anyone who attempts to solve a problem using anything other than a market is doing something foundationally immoral. In computer software design, which is something I know a little more about than I know about economics, we sometimes have to do allocation, where we have to decide which process gets access to which memory, or how much hard drive, or what priority on the processor. And sometimes we do things like increment and decrement ledgers to balance those processes out. It doesn't mean that that's the only way we solve that problem. And I could imagine a role for money in the future that is oriented around being a specific tool to solve a specific allocation problem, maybe time-bounded money or what have you. And maybe that's how we get at this idea that we decommodify money, because we have special purpose money, utility money, that is used for certain kinds of allocation problems, in the same way that, we're locked down here and my wife and daughter and I play Boggle every night, and we have a score sheet for our Boggle scores. We don't use that to allocate chores during the day. It exists in its own realm.
Yeah, I was saying something rather similar earlier, that money is basically a rationing chip. It's just a rationing chip you can use to get anything, which is a silly kind of rationing chip. On the other hand, while it seems reasonable to want to ration as little as possible, since rationing isn't a great thing, it's hard to imagine a society where you wouldn't ration anything. I also would agree that multiple forms of money, essentially when we're talking about money, we have to also think about what that is. As an anthropologist, I know that money in most human societies historically has been used largely to rearrange social relations and, appease people who are angry at you rather than to get stuff. People had other ways of getting stuff, or to arrange marriages or so forth and so on. So money can be used for purposes, but all that money is the principle that you can tell exactly how many of X equals Y. So rather than, you know, cardinal versus ordinal, that's all that it is. And it's hard to imagine there's a society where there'll be no context in which people will want to compare values as proportions. Sure, of course, people will always want to do that in different contexts. Markets are a whole different thing, and I wanted to throw that in, that, you know, markets barely exist in many aspects of our own lives right now, or we think they do. Market forces in terms of supply and demand probably explains about 20% of prices of most things we buy. You know, the very few markets that are almost entirely set by supply and demand are things, well, I mean, the stock market is, and that's why they call it the market. But it's not really necessarily essential to our lives. And, you know, things like street markets. I live on Portobello Road. You know, the price of an old Toodles scarf for a antique silver spoon is probably going to be set by supply and demand, by market forces. But it's, you know, and sure, there's no reason to not have things like that. But almost anything else that you buy, from a haircut to a pair of socks, you know, it's institutional, tradition, custom, political struggles. You know, I've been, you know, if I'm buying a banana, like, supply and demand doesn't have nearly as much importance as how, you know, your likelihood of getting shot if you try to do union organizing in Honduras, you know. So all of those things, you know, are determinants of the prices that we ascribe to the market. So yes, markets in the sort of abstract ideal sense don't exist in that many circles, but probably could. You know, I mean, in a utopian future society, it's not like we're going to be going to the souk in North Africa and saying, all you guys trading, cut it out. You know, in some places that's part of traditional life, and it doesn't involve enormous power differentials, and, you know, then it's a tool.
Thanks, David.
Guys, I've got to drop off. I've got a doctor's appointment, telemedicine. See you later.
Okay, thanks, Gary.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Also, Sarath, and then maybe we can start closing down. Maybe some last thoughts. Anybody who would like to speak? Sarath.
Just a small thing. This is actually a question to Julio and David, who have been working on this idea of money and the philosophy of money and what role it has in our lives. Now, the question is that using the technology that we have, which is accessible to our communities today, is it possible to subvert? I mean, there is no static definition of money. As you said, that money is a kind of a promises we make to each other. Now we can make different promises. We can make other promises. We can make secret promises. We can make community promises. I mean, you can. I mean, going by that definition, I think. Well, I just want to ask a question rather than a comment. That what's the subversive potential technology gives us to convert this into something for the community?
I would say, to some extent, I mean, more than the technology itself, is more like the ethics that people embed it with. So these common promises, that sharing our common promises, it's a way of maybe reformulating what the social form that we live on today is. You know, you could argue that you could have, let's say, a common basic income for, I don't know, Scotland or for the whole planet, outside of the current political boundaries of the day. So in a way, sort of, you know, making basic income or making money a commons is a way of reshaping the promises we make to each other and to the world. So yeah, it's maybe a way to challenge the categories of the day.
Yeah, just my closing thing would be just, you know, I think it's really interesting, this discussion, how it's kind of opened up all these different areas. And that's been one of the great pleasures of being involved with basic income, both organizing and talking about it, is how it does, you know, I think what it shows is how fundamental money is to this society, whatever it is, okay? And I'm not going to get into that one right now. But you know, it kind of, like, the question of actually giving everybody money kind of opens out all these other questions of, well, how do we actually organize society? And that's what I find really hopeful about the movement. and more, yeah. And just think that, you know, if we do manage to attain some kind of, whether it's emergency, recovery, permanent, whatever type of basic income in this country, which actually seems within our grasp pretty soon. I'm a bit worried on many levels, but I'm not going to go into that right now. You know, I think it will be a very grand experiment, and it'll be really interesting to see how the public reacts to that. And I really hope that the left gets their bloody heads around this, all right? Because I'm just so fed up of, you know, I mean, I love Ann Pettifor in many ways. I mean, but this whole thing that, you know, that a job guarantee is totally different, or a UBS is totally different, and you know, you have to make this choice because we're in this zero-sum game about money, is, you know, I think this conversation really kind of blows that out of the water for sure. You know, and again, it's just in my experience, you know, talking to people up and down the social scale on the street, you know, randomly, it really gets people to think about what kind of society we live in. And that's what I find really exciting about it. So thank you all for this really great discussion.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Barb.
Thanks.
Anybody else want to make a closing statement? Because, you know.
I mean, maybe I just want to respond to Sarath's. I mean, in terms of the, I mean, essentially the way I would see our system right now in terms of like the debate is, I mean, we have two main sets of money issuers in our current world, which is at a primary level, the state, and then the banking system. And then those that system of money is then used within a sort of horizontal, like much broader network of people who actually, so there's a whole sort of structure. And then all these debates we've been having have largely been occurring within that structure, saying, you know, who should have more power, the state or the banks, and how are we going to redistribute and so on and so on. But there's a whole separate debate around, can you entirely bypass that structure? So people, for example, like Julio's project around circles and the mutual credit systems and all these things work on essentially, can you create an alternative structure? But all of those really depend on, can you create entirely separate economic networks? And that's a huge sort of community building initiative. And it's a huge, a lot of people in the sort of, say, let's say the cryptocurrency world often fetishize the technology. They just think, all we got to do is build some technology and somehow the sort of like new economic networks miraculously going to emerge. But in reality, it's going to take huge amounts of ground level work before any of that technology actually manifests in a real alternative economy. Otherwise, the debate is, how do we use the existing structures to create better outcomes for people? And that's all I have to say.
Yeah, I totally agree with Brett and Julio, because we also did a lot of experimentation with cryptocurrency. We did this common coin, and we have been for long in the Fair Coin and Fair Cop pilot and cooperative. We did this Bank of the Common as a multi-currency wallet connecting this kind of experience. We did a lot of failure. I totally agree also on this point that on the base of this experience is very important not to separate this experimentation to the financial market or crypto markets. And we have not to it's very dangerous, this techno-fetishism around crypto and so on. And the very focus is how to build up an alternative system that is not based on financial bet or debt or credit and so on, but how to co-manage a circular economy and a common possibility to issue money for use for a useful community-based and also international networks or metropolitan networks and so on. So this is the most interesting scenario, I think. Also using fiat money sometimes, but the problem is how we can build up a trust union that is shaping a different kind of economical space, and the question behind it is how we can build up a mutual solidarity network and a good like social fabric under it. This is what I understood in the last 10 years.
I want to end with a small, crazy, half-baked idea. I think one of the political tools that Mahatma Gandhi used during the struggle with the British was the civil disobedience movement. And also attached to that was another tool he used called Satyagraha, which is going on a fast. So in those days, whenever Gandhi would announce any Satyagraha or any fasting, it used to create huge problems for the government, because he was also a public figure. Now, the crazy idea is that, talking about the monetary system of which we are all part, there is a subversive capacity? Is there a possibility of communities withdrawing from this huge monster and creating their own islands? And this can happen, I think, as an exception. But on scale, if it happens, I mean, imagining, wishful thinking, that don't you think that the system would be forced to reckon with it? I mean, there will be brutality. The state will pounce on them to ban this and ban that. Mm-hmm. But is there a way, if the technology, for example, today, it's the social media and the WhatsApp groups that are bringing news to us, not the television, not any of this. So the WhatsApp groups and the social media have tremendous subversive capacity to not make the state-sponsored or the media empires to control what we should know or what we should not know. Thank you so much. It's been a great and a fantastic, David and Julio. Thank you so much for this. Wonderful.
Well,
thank you, Sarath,
for actually putting it together.
No, thank you, Emanuele, also, and Christophe, and everybody who joined. Really nice first episode, and see you next time for another episode of Spectre.
Bye,
guys.
Peace.